These days, the airfield at Silloth-on-Solway, originally built for World War II, plays host to a Sunday market. Local industries now use the hangars and buildings that once teemed with Allied aircrew, civilian workers and planes of all kinds. In 1938, work began to clear 460 acres of farmland to the east of the town, and preparations were made for a new airfield to help in the impending war effort. Native Silloth man Lawrence Marshall was there at the time.
In the spring of '38, a car drove up with 4 gentlemen in it with dark suits, and then they said, "Well, we're here to commandeer the farm. You'll be able to use the grassland until the bulldozers arrive, but anything else stops now." And that was spring of '38, and then, as I say, autumn '38, they were knocking the hedges out and building the airfield.
The airfield was built to a high standard with many state-of-the-art technical buildings and a great variety of hangars. Around 90 dispersal areas and 3 large runways were constructed. On the 5th of June 1939, 12 weeks before the declaration of World War II, the airfield opened as No. 22 Maintenance Unit. Their role was to repair and maintain the planes being used to defend the country and fight the Germans. Shortly after the outbreak of war, Coastal Command established No. 1 Operational Training Unit at the airfield, with 22 MU remaining the Lodger unit. Soon a huge variety of aircraft were using Silloth: Airspeed Oxford, Blackburn Skua, Supermarine Spitfire, Hawker Hurricane, de Havilland Gypsy Moth, Avro Anson, Vickers Wellington, Lockheed Hudson and Blackburn Botha, the latter called bad luck planes because of the high number of faults and crashes. By the end of May 1940, 22MU had 271 aircraft and 11 of the hangars were fully occupied. During the Battle of Britain, hundreds of Hurricanes, fully equipped and ready for battle, were turned out by the MU, flying from Silloth to their operational stations. Silloth had a pair of Q decoy airfields close by at Pelleter and West Newton. They were built to attract enemy bombers away from the main Silloth Airfield. Wooden planes were built and parked on the false runways to add authenticity. Besides the work on maintenance and training, large bombers from 215 Squadron used Silloth as a forward operating airfield for air-to-air firing practice on one of the local ranges. Defences and training ranges were built close to the airfield. The so-called Cumberland machine gun and anti-tank rifle emplacement, said to be unique to Cumberland, was a concrete-filled sandbag pillbox. 2 were built near the end of Groom Point, but the sea long ago took this one's partner away. The influx of airmen and civilian workers from all over the United Kingdom and other Allied countries added hugely to the numbers of people living in and around Silloth. Local people were used to visiting holidaymakers, but many began hosting airfield personnel in their homes.
The whole of Silloth took people in, and there were very few houses that didn't have people in that were to do with the war. Huts, specially built, I say huts, with brick-built huts around the town. There's about 3 or 4 sites, as well as such as the school, the senior school here at Silloth. Aircraft personnel were billeted in it, but there were various sites around the town. Indeed, some of them are still there to this day.
Airmen who had learnt to fly in wide open spaces of the USA and Canada were sent to Silloth to get used to the misty and often crowded landscapes of Europe. A number of Polish airmen also found their way to Silloth Airfield. One of these men was Eugeniusz Antelak, who had flown with the Polish and the French Air Forces as a fighter pilot. Attached to RAF 309 Flight Squadron, he was sent to Silloth 22MU as a test pilot. While in Silloth, he met his future wife Patricia and settled in the town. Among many British civilian workers who arrived in Silloth were 2 19-year-old engineers, Rex Morris and George Doughty, who had been based together at RAF Rawton. Both men maintained a lifelong love of Silloth Airfield, writing after the war about their own experiences and some of the events that happened in the town. George wrote, "Two girls, Mary Todd and Nan Foster, were walking home from work at Cunliffe Owens at Causeway Head one lunchtime in July 45. They were having the afternoon off. Mary was thinking of her holiday only a few days away. They were chatting away, and due to the sunny weather, Mary had taken her coat off and was walking with it over her shoulder. They'd reached the point adjacent to the end of the main runway when a Wellington bomber came bursting through the hedge, swinging round on the road. The pilot had overshot the runway. In the confusion that reigned in trying to avoid the mountain of metal, propellers, etc., the coat came dislodged from Mary's grasp, but she managed to avoid being damaged in any way, as also did Nan. However, the aircraft had split in half, and Mary found herself right at the point where it had split, and a member of the aircrew fell out, almost at her feet. He was shaken, but appeared okay. The ambulance arrived and wanted to take the girls to the RAF hospital for a check-up and observation, but they both declined. They wanted to get home. Mary's coat was found under the aircraft. That was how near it was to a disaster. The crew were all okay, including the man who had spilled out, but the Wellington bomber was a write-off. You would think in a small community like Silloth people would have said something, but it took 55 years to reach my ears. On the other hand, could it be that a place like Silloth, that had a large aerodrome in the midst, children who had been brought up with it all did think of it as quite normal? George stayed in Silloth after the war and married a local girl called Elsie Patterson, who was an armourer at the airfield. Rex also had many tales to tell about his experiences in Silloth during the war years.
We were civilians, but we never get involved with the servicemen. And you get all the different trades. You got engines, they look after engines. The riggers look after the airframe. Armourers look after the guns. Radio mechanics, instruments. The only time we got involved with the service were the pilots. All the Air Force pilots did all the flight testing, and it's quite a busy place.
Among other Allied pilots arriving in Silloth was Jan Vella, a Czech airman who came to be much respected by the civilian workers at the airfield. Jan had escaped the occupation of his country, arriving in Silloth at number 22 MU in December 1941. Over the next months he test flew a range of newly repaired aircraft. He became so popular with civilian workers at the aerodrome that when he had news of a reposting to RAF Tain in Scotland, they presented him with a gold-plated wristwatch inscribed on the back. 3 years later, on 10th of January 1945, the plane Jan was travelling into London to be awarded a DFC for bravery crashed into the Scottish mountains. All 5 men on board were killed. They were later buried in the Czechoslovak section of Brookwood Military Cemetery near Woking in Surrey. Almost 30 years later, in 1973, a young hill walker called Philip Hammer came across the crash site on Beneverde. Amazingly, while kicking the ground and contemplating the crash and the fate of those on board, Philip suddenly unearthed the remains of the watch that had been presented to Jan in Silloth some 31 years earlier. The inscription was still clear. Presented to Flight Sergeant J. Vella by the workers of 22 MU RAF Station Silloth, Cumberland, 24th of December 1942. Despite his best efforts, Philip could not find any information about the watch's owner and placed it in a drawer, where it lay for the next 32 years. Then, in 2005, Philip came across an online article related to fatal crashes in the mountains and spotted Jan Vella's name written by Lindsay Drews. After Philip contacted Lindsay, a great deal of activity and official arrangements followed, and in October 2006, a small group of people from the United Kingdom, who had been involved in some capacity, flew with the watch to Jan's hometown of Kladno, 30 kilometres west of Prague. And so, 64 years after it had been presented to Jan by the civilian workers at Silloth Airfield, the remains of the watch, with the inscriptions clearly still visible, were presented to Jan's daughter Blazina along with a restruck DFC. Jan's granddaughter received a framed photograph of her brave grandfather and a miniature DFC. Next day, Jan was given a posthumous award of Freedom of the Town of Kladno, and a street was named after him. Many local Silloth people were involved with the airfield. Patrick and Doris Barker were born in Silloth, married in Christchurch, and both served on Silloth Airfield during World War II. Pat joined the RAF and began the war in France with the British Expeditionary Force, and then he was posted to 22 MU and was able to live with his wife at their home on Skinberness Road for a time before being posted to North Africa. Among his duties at Silloth, Pat worked as an operator on the Silloth Trainer. The trainer was developed by Wing Commander Isles. Using the fuselage of a Halifax bomber, it helped all members of an aircraft's crew to learn necessary drills and how to handle malfunctions. As well as basic flying behaviour, all engine, electric and hydraulic systems were simulated. An instructor's panel was used to monitor the training. Pat used to recall gleefully that he could even create explosions under the pilot's seat. Ferry pools were set up to ferry planes from one location to another. Some were related to the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy, and others were involved in auxiliary air transport tasks. Male and female civilian pilots attached to the Air Transport Auxiliary, the ATA, would arrive at a factory to pick up brand new planes and take them to one of the units thought to be far from the reach of enemy bombers. Heather Wood was a well-known Silloth resident who joined the ATA during World War II. After the plane's maintenance was completed, a civilian pilot was sent to ferry control to fly it to the front-line squadron, which could be anywhere in the UK. If the plane then got damaged in battle or needed overhauling, another civilian pilot would take it to a maintenance unit like 22 MU, while another one would deliver the serviceable plane to keep the squadron up to strength. ATA work was dangerous for men and women taking up the role of ferry pool pilots. Some were shot at by the enemy, and also occasionally by their own side. Weather was also a challenge. Silloth was particularly risky because of its situation on the Solway, as well as being so close to the Lake District fells. Rex Morris recounts a story of one brave woman pilot in the ATA who arrived at Silloth Airfield to transport a large plane to Carlisle.
I think one came one day, and her name was Diana Ramsey. She was on the stage professionally, and it was a Mustang she'd come to collect, which was quite a potent aeroplane. She said she'd not seen one before and she'd not flown one. And she took it down the runway, got the tail up, and I think she lost her nerve. So she managed to stop, taxied by, we went out to see her in the van. She said, "I'm sorry about that, lad." She says, "I'll have another go tomorrow." Then they picked her up next morning, and she was good as a word. I mean, the engine was about 1,200 horsepower. These girls, they were good, they were brave too.
Silloth Airfield was bombed once or twice, though very little damage was actually done. In 1940, before radar was sufficiently developed, the Royal Aircraft Establishment based at Farnborough believed bright flares were needed to assist with air-to-air gunnery at night. It was believed Silloth Airfield, being so far north, would be free of enemy planes and so a safe place to test the flares. During the experiment, a Hampton bomber with flares fitted under its wings followed a Whitley bomber on a test run. The flare was lit, but the Hampton pilot was completely blinded by the bright reflection from his plane's spinning propellers. The flares were set to last 3.5 minutes, so the pilot in the Hampton immediately warned the Whitley pilot to dive and get safely out of the way. At that point, however, ground control warned that an enemy aircraft was nearby. Before anything could be done, the enemy bomber used the light from the Whitley to bomb the airfield, though little damage was done. After that experiment and its unintended consequences, training programs were revised. George recounts another story of an accident on the 26th of June 1944, which was little reported at the time. In those days, George was courting his future wife Elsie. They'd been to the pictures at the Majestic Cinema at the junction of Solway Street and Wampole Street. On their way home, They heard a noise like machine gun ammunition exploding and saw the sky above the airfield orange with flames. They immediately ran down Wampool Street towards the old gasometer to get a clear view. They'd gone only halfway when they heard the co-op window fall out because of the blast. The glow in the sky died and all became quiet. Next day, when George arrived on the airfield, it was clear that a great deal of damage had been caused. Many of the Anson aircraft were in a sorry state, with their fabric sides torn or detached. Some of the wooden wings had received red-hot debris and showed large scorch marks, some very deep and in dire need of repair. The runway had a very deep and long crater in it, around 26 feet by 12 feet. And as Rex Morris also recalls, the story reported in the press was that the plane had landed short of the runway rather than on it. The insinuation was that no damage was done to the airfield, a cover-up of the real damage to keep the news secret from the enemy. The full story, however, was that a crew from OTU were given the task of doing an anti-submarine patrol off the Isle of Man. On takeoff, the pilot noticed an engine overheating, and suddenly there was a bang and flames shot out of it. This quickly ignited the wing, which had its share of 14 hours worth of fuel in the tanks. The pilot immediately turned the aircraft to make an emergency landing, realizing that he had to be careful due to the load of depth charges on board. He didn't want to overheat them by scraping along the concrete runway, because the undercarriage was unserviceable due to the fire, so he decided to put the plane down on its belly on the grass. Skidding to a halt seemed to take an eternity, and the rotation of the propellers when touching the ground had pulled the Wellington round towards the runway. The aircrew managed to get out through the top hatch, though one member had to hold it open for the rest. They ran for their lives, blowing their whistles to warn people away, including the rescue services, who had already been put on full alert. The plane exploded some 3 minutes later. The navigator, who told this story after the war, said, "We all owe our lives to Squadron Leader Cox, the calmest man I ever had the pleasure to fly with." One of the wireless operators was slightly injured, but the incident could have been an absolute tragedy. All on board went on through the war together and survived. However, with so many trainees and close proximity to the sea in the Skinberness marshes, accidents and crashes were inevitable. 64 aircraft were lost by No. 1 OTU during their time at Silloth. The Solway Firth was grimly nicknamed Hudson Bay because of the number of Hudson planes that crashed there. A corner of Causeway Head Cemetery, which lies close to the airfield, became the last resting place for the brave airmen of all the Allied nations who were killed during their time at Silloth. After the end of the war, some aircraft were refurbished and prepared for sale to foreign air forces or the civilian market. The ATA was abandoned, but a great many planes still had to be ferried between locations, so as a result, No. 5 Ferry Pool was formed at Silloth in 1945, specifically to work for 22MU. It had been expected that civilian staff would apply to leave, but many more than expected continued to work at the MU for a number of years. Much of the work was related to the scrapping of surplus World War II aircraft, among which were the York, Dakota, Mosquito, Lancaster, and untold Ansons. Many were buried at nearby locations, including a quarry close to Silloth. The airfield had been used in 1941 when part of the film A Yank in the RAF, starring Tyrone Power and Betty Grable, was filmed at Silloth. And in 1954, a few airworthy Lancasters returned for the making of the classic film The Dam Busters, starring Richard Todd and Michael Redgrave. Freighters of Manx Airlines briefly operated from the airfield in 1956. In 1960, the last military flight left the airfield, and then in 1961, the airfield went up for sale. Memories of Silloth Airfield's contribution to the war effort are not forgotten. Images are posted and reposted on several local Facebook pages and on the Silloth Airfield website. It is hoped in future to continue the quest to preserve Silloth Airfield's rich heritage and continue to record its contribution to World War II. When the Nazis threatened Europe, all the land was called to arms, and an aerodrome was built here among the peaceful farms. It was not a combat station, just a workshop and a school, where men came for instruction and machines came for renewal. And the town was full of guests as it had never been before, guests who travelled from around the world to exercise for war. Men learned gunnery and bombing, navigation and the skills, how to hunt for submarines, and when they found them, how to kill. But to exercise for battle is to sit a lethal test, where failure claims the lives of the weakest and the best. And 60 heroes lie in graves beside the Solway shore, who saw the face of death before they ever faced the war. Flying low over the wave-tops, flying blind on moonless nights, sitting cold in lonely turrets, peering over cannon sights. They flew many times of aircraft, but the name that still survives is the fatal Lockheed Hudson, for it claimed so many lives in the waters of the Solway, and so many went astray, that the waters of the Solway were rechristened Hudson Bay. Some were instantly recovered, some were never seen again, and many sank or drifted to be cast up now and then, and a few returned so damaged that their names could not be guessed, flayed and broken by the ocean, and its creatures did the rest. For the creatures of the ocean take whatever comes their way, and they reaped a royal harvest in the years of Hudson Bay. Now, when strangers bring their caravans to Silloth by the sea, they're looking for a holiday with peace and harmony, and driving into town they seldom cast a second glance at a strange block of factories and light electric plant. But the buildings have a history, and where tourists camp today, other strangers came to Silloth who have never gone away. Flying low over the wave-tops, flying blind on moonless nights, sitting cold in lonely turrets, peering over cannon sights. They flew many times of aircraft, but the name that still survives is the fatal Lockheed Hudson, for it claimed so many lives in the waters of the Solway, and so many went astray, that the waters of the Solway were rechristened Hudson Bay.